Microsoft just changed what Game Pass means. For years, the pitch was simple: subscribe, and the biggest Xbox games would be there when they launched. That was the magic of the service. It made the monthly fee feel like a shortcut around full-price releases, especially when Call of Duty entered the conversation after the Activision Blizzard deal. Now that promise has been narrowed. Xbox lowered the price of Game Pass Ultimate from $29.99 to $22.99 a month in the United States. Personal Computer Game Pass dropped from $16.49 to $13.99. That sounds like good news, and for a lot of players it is. But the trade is the part everybody is arguing about. Future Call of Duty titles will no longer arrive on Game Pass Ultimate or Personal Computer Game Pass on day one. Instead, new Call of Duty games are set to arrive during the following holiday season, about 1 year after launch. Existing Call of Duty games already in the library stay there. Other day one releases can still happen. The service is not dead. Game Pass is not suddenly empty. But the biggest annual shooter is no longer part of the launch day promise. That is the story. Not because one game moved, because Call of Duty was the symbol that proved Game Pass could carry almost anything. When Microsoft bought Activision Blizzard, players immediately understood the possible future. Call of Duty on Game Pass Day 1 was not just a perk, it was a statement. It said that the most expensive, most mainstream, most reliable premium franchise in gaming could live inside a subscription without making players buy it separately at launch. That idea changed how people talked about Xbox. It changed how people thought about subscriptions. It changed how people calculated value. If you were already buying Call of Duty every year, Game Pass Ultimate could feel like an obvious deal. Instead of paying full price for one game, you could pay a monthly fee and get Call of Duty, a huge catalog, online benefits, cloud access, and a stream of other releases. But now the math is different. A player who wants the next Call of Duty the day it drops has a choice. Keep Game Pass and buy Call of Duty. Cancel Game Pass and buy Call of Duty. Stay subscribed and wait about a year. Or treat Game Pass as a library service, not a replacement for the biggest annual launch. That is a major shift. And what makes it interesting is that Microsoft did not just take something away. It lowered the price at the same time. So this is not a simple story where the company raises prices and players lose. It is more complicated than that. Microsoft is trying to reset the value equation. It is saying Game Pass costs less now, but the most valuable annual release gets protected at launch. That is the new deal. And the question is whether players see that as fair, smart, disappointing, or a broken promise. Because if Game Pass can keep players subscribed while also making them buy Call of Duty at full price, Microsoft may have found a more controlled version of the subscription model. Not the everything-included fantasy, not the old retail-only world either. Something in between. You subscribe for the library. You buy the biggest game. Then a year later, that biggest game joins the library and helps keep the cycle alive. That is why the change hits harder than a normal price update. A cheaper subscription is easy to understand. A missing day one promise is easy to understand. But both happening at the same time makes players ask what the service is actually becoming. For Microsoft, that could be smart business. For players, it could feel like paying twice. And for the rest of the gaming industry, it may be a sign that the subscription wars are entering a very different phase. That is the part regular players feel first. The headline is not just corporate strategy. It is the moment a monthly gaming bill and a yearly game purchase start competing with each other again. To understand why this matters, you have to separate the old Game Pass dream from the new Game Pass reality. The old dream was unlimited access. That is not exactly what Game Pass ever was, but it was the feeling. Every time a major first-party game arrived on day one, the service became easier to explain. You did not need a spreadsheet. You did not need a financial model. You just needed the idea that your subscription gave you the games people were talking about right now. That is why Call of Duty mattered so much. Most games do not define a service by themselves. Call of Duty can. It launches every year. It sells at full price. It has campaign players, multiplayer players, Warzone players, casual players, competitive players, and people who buy it because their friends buy it. It is one of the few franchises that can make a subscription feel necessary to a giant audience. Black Ops 6, launching day one on Game Pass in 2024, was the proof of concept. Microsoft could point to huge engagement. Players could point to immediate value. The message was easy to understand. The biggest shooter was included, but the business side was always more complicated. Call of Duty is not a small, independent game looking for discovery. It is not an older catalog title trying to find a second life. It is not a niche game that benefits mainly from reach. It is a full-price annual machine. It makes money from launch sales, deluxe editions, ongoing spending, and a massive player base that shows up every year. Putting that inside a subscription on day one can drive engagement, but it can also shift sales away from direct purchases on Xbox and personal computer. That is the trade. The player sees value because they do not have to buy the game separately. The platform has to ask whether the subscription growth is big enough to make up for that missing purchase revenue. That is where the new policy starts to make sense from Microsoft's point of view. Lower the subscription price so more people can justify staying. Keep existing Call of Duty games in the library so the franchise still supports Game Pass. Continue offering hundreds of games and many day one releases so the service still feels valuable. But protect the newest Call of Duty launch window, where direct sales are strongest. That is the balance. It is not as exciting as the old promise, but it may be more sustainable. And this is where players are split. Some players will look at the lower monthly price and say, this is better. If they do not care about Call of Duty at launch, they are paying less for a large library. If they mostly use Game Pass to sample games, revisit older titles, or play with friends, the price cut is real value. Other players will feel like the service lost its crown jewel. If you subscribe specifically because Call of Duty was day one, this feels like the deal changed. The monthly fee is lower, yes, but the game you cared about most is now a separate, full-price purchase if you want it at launch. That is why the word trust keeps coming up. Subscriptions depend on trust. You are not just buying a game, you are buying access to a changing promise. The library can grow, the library can shrink, the price can move, benefits can be added, benefits can be removed. The entire relationship depends on whether players believe the current offer will still feel good later. The hard part is that both sides can be right. A player can be happy the price dropped and still be annoyed that the headline game moved out of day one. A player can understand why Call of Duty needs a full-price launch and still feel like the subscription was sold differently. A player can keep Game Pass and still trust it less. That is the danger for Xbox. The value may still be strong, but the feeling may be weaker. Game Pass is still valuable, but it is now asking players to think harder. And once a subscription makes players think harder, the simple magic starts to fade. The everyday math is where this story becomes real. Imagine the player who only really cares about Call of Duty. Under the old model, a higher Game Pass ultimate price could still be easy to justify if that player was going to play the new Call of Duty every year. The service became the path to the game. Everything else was a bonus. Under the new model, that player has to make a decision. If they want Call of Duty on day one, they need to buy it. They can still keep Game Pass for the catalog, older Call of Duty titles, online benefits, cloud play, and other releases. But the annual shooter is no longer absorbed by the monthly fee at launch. That can feel like a double charge. Even if the math works out in some cases, the feeling matters. A dedicated player might say, why am I paying monthly and still buying the biggest game separately? A casual player might say, this is fine, I can wait a year. A family might appreciate the lower monthly cost because several people use the catalog. A personal computer player might stay because the new price is easier to swallow. A player with a backlog might not care at all. That is what makes this change hard to judge with one simple take. For some people, Game Pass got better. For others, it lost the one thing that made it impossible to cancel, and that is probably the point. Microsoft seems to be moving Game Pass away from being a blanket answer for every major release. Instead, it is becoming a more segmented value product. The catalog is the foundation. Selected day one games are still the hook. Call of Duty becomes the exception that arrives later. That is not the end of subscriptions. It is the maturity of subscriptions. You can see a similar pattern in streaming. At first, streaming felt simple. Pay one fee and get a giant library. Then the services multiplied, prices went up, ad tiers appeared, password sharing rules changed, premium content moved into different windows. Some things stayed included, some things became separate. The offer became more complicated because the business became more expensive. Games are not exactly movies or television. A game can take hundreds of hours. A multiplayer game can become a habit. A full-price launch can be an event. Players care about ownership, progress, friends, storage, downloads, and long-term access in ways that are different from watching a show. But the subscription pattern is familiar. First comes simplicity, then comes growth, then comes pressure, then comes segmentation. That is where Game Pass seems to be now. The service is not disappearing, it is being refined. Microsoft is trying to find the point where players still feel value, but the company is not giving up too much revenue from its biggest annual product. Other publishers will watch this closely. If the new model works, it tells the industry something important. You can use a subscription to build loyalty and keep players engaged, while still protecting full-price sales for your biggest release. That could influence future third-party deals. It could affect how PlayStation Plus thinks about major games. It could shape how publishers negotiate day one access. It could even change how annual franchises think about launch windows. The lesson may not be that subscriptions failed. The lesson may be that subscriptions cannot treat every game the same. A small game might need discovery. A mid-sized game might need reach. An older game might need a second life. But a massive annual franchise may still need the full-price launch window. That is important because every publisher wants the same thing Microsoft wants. They want recurring revenue, predictable engagement, and strong launch sales at the same time. But players only have so much money, and every subscription has to prove why it deserves to stay active. And if Call of Duty is the game that proves that, then this policy shift is bigger than Xbox. That pressure does not stop with Microsoft. If the largest shooter can move to a delayed subscription window, other companies will ask whether their biggest games should do the same. The strongest argument for Microsoft is discipline. The company tried the aggressive version of Game Pass. It pushed the idea that bigger games, bigger libraries, and bigger benefits could justify higher monthly prices. Then the price got too high for many players. The reaction was loud enough that Microsoft lowered the cost and admitted through the change itself that the previous value equation needed work. That matters. A lower price helps people who were ready to leave. It makes the service more accessible. It keeps the catalog attractive. It gives players who do not care about day one Call of Duty a better deal. And it protects the franchise that may be too valuable to place fully inside the subscription at launch every year. That is the business case. The strongest argument against Microsoft is trust. Players were sold on a vision. Game Pass was supposed to be the place where the biggest Xbox-owned games arrived immediately. Call of Duty became the loudest example of that future. Once that example changes, players naturally wonder what else can change later. That does not mean Xbox abandoned day one releases for everything. It does not mean Game Pass is dead. It does not mean every subscriber will cancel. It does not mean Call of Duty will never be on the service. But it does mean the service feels less simple, and simple was the power. When a subscription is easy to explain, people join without overthinking it. When it becomes a set of exceptions, windows, delayed releases, tiers, and calculations, players start asking whether the monthly fee actually matches their habits. That is the real pressure now. Game Pass can still win if it becomes the best library in gaming at a fairer price. It can still win if players discover enough games they would not have bought otherwise. It can still win if Xbox keeps delivering strong first-party releases, useful benefits, and clear communication. But it cannot rely on the same dream it used before. The promise has changed. Now the player has to decide what Game Pass is for. Is it the place you go for everything? Or is it the place you go for the library, while buying the biggest games separately? That question is bigger than Call of Duty. It is the question every gaming subscription has to answer eventually. And this is why GamingRealm exists. Not just to repeat a headline, but to explain what the change actually means for the person holding the controller. A price cut is not just a price cut. A delayed release is not just a delayed release. Together, they show how gaming companies are trying to train players into new buying habits. That is also why the larger game plan by Dial-On ecosystem matters. The whole system is built around turning complicated stories into clear workflows, clear scripts, and clear decisions. The prompt products, the creator systems, and the realm channels all come from the same idea. If the information is messy, build a better system to understand it. This Game Pass story is exactly that kind of messy. It has corporate logic, it has player frustration, it has subscription fatigue, it has Call of Duty sales pressure, it has a lower monthly price that genuinely helps some people, it has a missing day one promise that genuinely hurts others, and it has an industry watching to see whether players accept the new math. So the takeaway is not that Microsoft failed. The takeaway is that Game Pass is growing up. The wild version of the subscription model, where every massive release could be treated like one more library edition, is giving way to something more careful. Maybe that makes the service healthier. Maybe it makes the service less exciting. Maybe it does both. But players should pay attention, because standards change through moments like this. If this works, more publishers may protect their biggest launches while still using subscriptions for older games, smaller games, and delayed access. If it backfires, Microsoft may have to rethink the balance again. Either way, the Game Pass conversation has changed, and now I want to know how you see it. Would you rather pay more every month if it meant Call of Duty stayed day one, or pay less each month and buy the biggest annual games separately when you really want them?